When Maximilian III Joseph came to power in 1745, Bavaria had for several years been embroiled in the War of the Austrian Succession. His father, Charles Albert, had entered it to press his claims on Habsburg lands, and although initially successful, he proved unable to maintain his gains. With this as a backdrop, Maximilian was soon forced to abandon the great power policy that had been pursued by his predecessors, and his reign would come to be marked by peace and reconstruction. Although staunchly Catholic and a supporter of absolutism, he was also a man of the Enlightenment. The Elector founded new academies, enlarged the freedom of the press, and introduced a new civil code. This, among many other things, has earned him the epithet the Much Beloved. Maximilian was born in Munich in 1727. He was the first son of the Bavarian Elector Charles Albert and his wife, the Austrian Archduchess Maria Amalia. Because of the occupation of Bavaria during the War of the Austrian Succession, he spent a formative part of his adolescence in Frankfurt, from where his father then ruled as emperor. Two teachers were brought in to shape the young man's education. The first was Johann Adam von Ickstadt, a blacksmith's son who had risen to become a professor of constitutional law and was a major proponent of the Enlightenment. The other, a Jesuit called Daniel Stadler, taught him philosophy and mathematics and would become his personal confessor. Both of them continued to exert influence on Maximilian even as an adult, and Stadler in particular would become a close confidant of the Elector. Like many of his ancestors, Maximilian studied at the University of Ingolstadt and also had to complete a technical apprenticeship. In this case, he decided to take up wood turning and also specialized in particular on the turning of ivory. When his father passed away in January of 1745, Maximilian was still not quite 18 years old, but was nonetheless thrust into power over a state in deep crisis. At this point, Bavaria had only recently been liberated from Austrian occupation and was at a high risk from falling once again. Wavering between the war and peace factions, he initially tried to continue fighting the Habsburgs with French assistance. However, Maximilian's mother and many senior military officials sought peace, and French willingness to support him turned out to be much lower than initially thought. Then, in March, Austrian troops occupied parts of northern Bavaria with ease and won the decisive Battle of Pfaffenhofen. Militarily defeated and burdened by a mountain of debt, Maximilian now had no choice but to end the war. On the 22nd of April, he signed the peace treaty of Füssen with his Austrian counterpart, Maria Theresa. It forced him to acknowledge the pragmatic sanction of 1713, thereby abandoning his claims to the Habsburg inheritance. Furthermore, he had to support the imperial candidacy of Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, as well as those of future Habsburgs. Finally, he promised to influence the votes of the electorate of the Palatinate and the electorate of Cologne in Francis's favor. In return for this, Maximilian was allowed to keep his electorate, and his father's election as Holy Roman Emperor was posthumously acknowledged as legitimate by the Austrians. He was also exempt from paying war reparations, and as per a secret clause, he was even given subsidies of 40,000 guilders to ease the country's most urgent financial difficulties. More of these subsidies were to follow. With the loss of French support, Maximilian became completely dependent on money from the Austrians and their allies, the Dutch and British, and consequently had to align his foreign policy with their interests. He therefore soon sent auxiliary forces to help his former enemies in the Netherlands until the end of the War of the Austrian Succession in 1748. By the mid-1750s, however, a 10-year subsidy contract with them had run out, and Maximilian began a policy of rapprochement with the French. In the Treaty of Compiègne, signed in 1756, he committed himself against subsidies of 300,000 guilders annually not to provide the empire with troops against France and to strive for neutrality in the event of a war between France and Austria. This arrangement would crumble within that very same year, however, as the so-called diplomatic revolution turned France and Austria into allies. When the 7 Years' War later broke out in May, Maximilian took their side against Britain and Prussia, although did so cautiously as a lasting weakening of the Prussians, the only real counterweight to the Habsburgs in the empire, would not be in his interest. Apart from Bavarian troops serving in the imperial army, he sent only a small force of 4,000 men and withdrew them already about a year and a half into the conflict. Later on, he and the Wittelsbach elector Charles Theodore of the Palatinate would also contribute to enforcing the neutrality of the empire. Having steered his country away from major military engagements, Maximilian could focus on internal issues. His primary concern was to address the poor economic situation, and much was done to encourage agriculture, industry, and the exploitation of Bavaria's mineral wealth. In 1747, he founded the Nymphenburg porcelain manufactory, which, through the works of sculptor Franz Anton Bastelli, would soon become famous across Europe. Other commercial endeavors include the founding of a faience factory at Friedberg Castle, the construction of a textile factory in Munich, and the creation of a transshipment point for the export of salt to Switzerland in the city of Buchhorn. To enlarge the available amount of farmland, woods were cleared and hitherto unusable wetlands were drained. From 1752 to 60, a land survey was also carried out to be able to better plan government action, and Bavaria's first ever census was undertaken beginning in 1771. Furthermore, a ban on emigration was imposed in hopes of controlling the country's population, although this policy would later have to be relaxed. The reason was a harvest failure, which caused a great famine in 1770. The situation eventually became so dire that the elector was forced to take out loans for the Netherlands and even sell parts of his crown jewels to provide grain for the population. But Maximilian's economic policy proved largely successful, and together with his very restrained court expenditure, Bavaria's debt could be halved over the course of his reign. Being a proponent of absolutism, Maximilian also sought to centralize his state. As a step in this direction, he tried to decrease the power of the estates, although was unable to do so because of his financial dependency on them. He also began to economically integrate the free imperial cities of Regensburg and Augsburg and put the church under increasing state influence. His reign saw attempts to tax church land, as well as the abolishment of the Jesuit order, and consequently also their censorship of the press. These policies do not reveal a lack of piety, however, as the elector was himself deeply religious. An expression of this can be seen in his ban of the Oberammergau Passion Play, which reenacts the last days of Jesus, arguing that the greatest secret of our holy religion does not belong on the stage. The Bavarian administration, although in urgent need of reform, was mostly left untouched during his reign. Maximilian's time in power would, on the other hand, see a major modernization of the legal system through the Codex Maximilianus Bavaricus Civilis. Enacted in 1756, it brought hitherto unseen levels of clarity of definition and would remain in use until the year 1900. The main motive behind its introduction was the hope that a greater legal clarity would reduce the time of procedures and thereby save money. But despite having introduced a more modern system, many very archaic laws remained in use during his reign. Offences such as witchcraft and heresy were still punishable, and particularly cruel versions of the death penalty, like death by burning or death by the breaking wheel, were still in use. Unlike his predecessors, Maximilian III Joseph did not leave behind many great works of architecture. The poor economic situation left him unable to finance large construction projects, and in essence he was limited to renovating or completing older buildings. An exception to this rule was the construction of the Cuvillier Theatre, a Rococo masterpiece. Designed by and named after the architect François de Cuvillier, it served as the Bavarian court theatre and replaced an older one that had been destroyed by fire. It was built outside the Munich residence from 1751 to 53, although after its unfortunate destruction in World War II, it was rebuilt in one of the residence's wings. Maximilian was known to enjoy theatre and opera quite a lot, and if it weren't for a lack of funds, he probably would have employed Mozart at his court. Despite this missed opportunity, one of the composer's works, an Italian opera called La Finita Giardiniera, was premiered in the old opera house at Salvatorplatz in Munich. Cuvillier was also commissioned for other projects, like the creation of the Stone Hall in Nymphenburg Palace, and in 1768, the same year that he passed away, he created a draft for the completion of the Theatine Church. The facade of this building had remained unfinished since its foundation in the days of Ferdinand Maria, and now he proposed completing it in the Rococo style. After the architect's death, the plans were, with a few modifications, carried out by his son, François de Cuvillier the Younger. This building would be one of the last of its kind, however, as just a few years later, the Rococo style fell out of favor. In an edict issued in 1771, Maximilian practically forbids its use in church buildings, referring to the extravagant style as ridiculous and calling for noble simplicity in future architecture. A number of important educational institutions were founded during Maximilian's reign and would go on to be of lasting importance. For example, the Munich Academy of Fine Arts can trace its history back to this time, as does the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Compulsory education was also enacted already in 1771, although the reform proved impossible to implement due to a lack of funds and of teachers, and wouldn't be put into practice until 1802. The latter part of his reign would focus on the question of succession. Maximilian had married his cousin, Maria Anna Sophia of Saxony, in 1747, but their marriage remained childless. Additionally, many male members of his family had occupied positions as princely bishops and were therefore unable to produce legitimate heirs. This ended up making Maximilian the last member of the junior branch of the Wittelsbach dynasty, which had ruled Bavaria ever since the 14th century. The question of who would succeed him soon became a matter of great interest in European diplomacy, and the elector, perhaps wisely, began to have all of his food tested for poisoning before eating. Poison, however, would not be the cause of his death. The story goes that at the beginning of December 1777, Maximilian Joseph rode in his carriage through Munich, and on the ride, as he passed a clock tower, the mechanism broke and the clock struck 77 times. Commenting to the passengers, Maximilian decided that this was an omen and that his years had run out. Within days, he was stricken with a strange disease which none of his 15 doctors could diagnose. But by Christmas, it had become clear that he suffered from a particularly virulent strain of smallpox, a disease that he had refused to be vaccinated against despite prescribing it for subjects. He passed away on the 30th of December and was buried in the Theatine Church. According to an earlier agreement, Charles Theodore, the Elector Palatine, would be his successor.